The Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel Baker.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the Age of Uncertainty podcast, exclusive for the Agile Network. This one is all about immutableness and Scrum. Now, this episode is pain. Proper pain. I mean beyond pain. If you can imagine pain. I'll tell you what's just happened. We've just had a really good Agile Network Roundtable. This is the basis of this piece. I was going to film that roundtable, film the discussions, film some of the conversations we had, and use that as part of this episode. Right? Maybe take out the attendees. It's not fair to show them on camera, but actually some of the material I've come up with, some of the ideas, and run it through with you, filmed, and then put on this program. It went brilliantly. I was really proud of what I've done. I checked the recording. There was no recording. So I'm going to be having the chat again. So at some points there may be cuts. And those cuts will be when I go, have I said this before? Yes, I have, but to someone else. Okay. And we'll be, you know what I mean? So just behold with me on that. So the entire point of this episode, by the way, is, if you remember, I've been working on this thing called NAME, which is a silly name for something that should be nameless. New Agile Method Experiments. Okay, here we go, on the screen. And I've even created a new little badge for it. Why? I have no idea, but I love doing a badge. New Agile Method Experiments. So I've been, over the past months actually, running experiments on the cutting edge of Agile. Some thought experiments, some sort of philosophical experiments, some practical experiments with real clients and real subjects on trying to expand our knowledge in the Agile space, trying to push at the edge a bit as the world's being cannibalized with the alleged death of Agile that we keep hearing about, thinking, no, we're evolving. What's the next step we're evolving to? And there's been a variety of conversations on this. If you've watched the previous video, you will see the conversation on tessellization, this concept I've been playing with in terms of scaling. Really half-formed, but still an interesting idea. Well, the next conversation is something really controversial in our space, actually. This has been a real bit of a dog whistle for a lot of people. It's caused a lot of arguments and concerns in the Agile space, especially amongst the nerdier people in our profession who have really deep dived this. And this is the word immutable. The second area I have been experimenting with is with the term immutable, right? And what that means in Agile. This is an incredibly controversial term in the official definition or specification of Scrum, and it's been horribly underexplained by people. So what I want to do in this video is basically discuss where the term comes from, why it exists, and how that term could both help and hinder us. And perhaps this entire idea of immutable could be a concept to discuss and understand to help us actually come up with some new and better ways of working in our world. Where does the word immutable come from in our space? It comes from something called the Scrum Guide. Now, I'm going to assume that since you're on the Agile Network, you know what the Scrum Guide is. Yeah? But if you don't, I'll give you a quick explanation. The Scrum Guide is the official specification of Scrum, one of the most famous and popular Agile methods. The guide itself was written's a strong term. It was contributed to by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, the co-creators of Scrum. Co-creators is a bit of a strong term as well. Two of the major big influencers in the world of Scrum. So this document, this specification, they own it. They sort of curate it as product owners. There's a variety of other ghostwriters behind the scenes on it, but they own the work and own the material, and they put together this official specification of Scrum, right? And Scrum, what is it? Sprints, Scrum Masters, product owners, etc. Now, at the very end of the document is just before the thanks. So the final thing is like, hey, thanks to the people who helped us invent Scrum. But before that is something called the end note. And I'd like to read that to you because that's where this controversial issue has started. Scrum is free and offered in this guide. The Scrum framework, as outlined herein, is immutable. While implementing only parts of Scrum is possible, the result is not Scrum. Scrum exists only in its entirety and functions well as a container for other techniques, methodologies, and practices. So this has caused a lot of concerns in our industry, this phrase immutable. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, Nigel, what the hell does immutable mean?
Nigel, what the hell does immutable mean?
Well, immutable, I'll give you this is the answer from the Oxford English Dictionary, by the way. Immutable means unchanging over time or unable to be changed. It's derived from the Latin in, which means not, and mutabilis, which means mutable or changeable. Okay? That's where it comes from. So the idea unchanging over time or unable to be changed. And straight away, we're into controversy because you get social warriors on LinkedIn saying, how can something be agile, the term agile, flexible, adaptable, whilst almost being immutable, unchanging? They seem to have this really weird issue with it. Like, how can something be unchanging yet flexible? Like, there's a real hypocrisy there, or an oxymoronic behaviour there. And that's interesting to look at straight away. There's loads of ways. I've tried to use examples here to explain to people, and they haven't always worked. My favourite example always used to be a gymnast. A gymnast is immutable. Oh, you don't cut his leg off or something. But the gymnast themselves, she or he, are incredibly flexible, incredibly adaptable, and can do very great things. They are both whole, yet flexible. So they don't have to be two separations. Flexible doesn't have to mean piecemeal. However, I came across the best example ever last week when I was on holiday. So I was on holiday at the Three Beaks Cliff place in Wales, in Gower, in a tent, going on long walks, etc., in the wind and the rain, as we get in summer in Wales. And I discovered the greatest thing ever whilst I was walking along. Now, officially, this is the greatest thing ever for an 8-year-old boy, but I'll tell you now, I'm an 8-year-old boy at heart, and I found it the greatest thing ever as well, which was a stick. Have you ever found a stick? Sticks are just the best things ever. A stick, like a long thing, bit of wood. Brilliant. You find one, you pick it up. Lovely good bit of stick there. That's useful. I could use that for things. Great for a walk. Use it as a walking stick. Going up the hills, walking along, feeling like a bit like Gandalf. Fantastic, So flexible a stick. You can nudge things, give a poke on things. What's that thing there? Let's get out the way. Flick things away with it. So adaptable, so usable, that stick. When you're younger, perhaps when you're holding that stick, it magically turns into a sword. Or, if you're a person of a certain age, it turns into a lightsaber. Oh, great fun. Oh, you can't beat a stick, can you? What a great tool. But the stick itself is unyielding, unchanging. It is long, it is thin, it is made of wood, it is immutable. Yet it's incredibly flexible, incredibly adaptable, incredibly useful in a variety of settings. So that's a good way to look at Scrum in its entirety, really. A bit like a stick. Something that's got multiple applications and how you use it, but this thing itself has a certain structure, a certain DNA to it that is unchanging. Right? So that's an interesting way to look at it. But what I really wanted to talk about was something I hinted at a moment before. When people talk about immutable, often when they think about unchanging, you could use a different word, unyielding. And what that can mean is slight cult mentality with Scrum. Hey, this thing is unchanging. This is like forever. This is immutable. And perhaps treating it a little bit like holy words, like the 10 Commandments coming down on tablets of stone. It is tablets, isn't it? I believe it's tablets. Coming down on tablets of stone. Ah, the holy words of Scrum have arrived. And people treating it with too much religiousness or cult zeal can often mean they lack an appreciation of nuance, or lack an appreciation of the delicacy of the context. Basically ignoring context, thinking, look, I have this magic tool, this magic thing, it's the answer. What's the question? And that can lead you to a whole load of issues, like the old joke, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so you have this thing you try and apply in context where it wouldn't work. I've seen that problem. I can see that being an issue. I can also see an issue of being very insular-minded, bounded, but in the wrong way, closed-minded with Scrum. Scrum is all you need. This is this wonderful thing. These few rules will get you through everything. And we know that's not true. And we know it doesn't have complete applicability everywhere else. Context, as I love to say, context is king, queen, jack, 10, 9, 8. Context is the whole blooming deck of cards. And so if you ignore context, you're going to get eaten up by your context. However, context is also used as a horribly big excuse for not changing stuff. My context is so special. My company's so special. We have the amount of times I've heard people say, well, we can't do that in our context. And what they really mean is, it's too hard. I don't want to do it. I don't want to change anything and be difficult. I just want to have stand-ups and use Jira or something. And so I'm very contemptuous of context as well. Whilst being completely understanding of it, we're not in the same universe. All of us, we're all living in these different worlds. I also am a little bit withering sometimes. We're like, yeah, we are in different worlds, but that's not different. That's just an excuse. You're just trying to avoid it. You're trying to avoid making things better in your space, treating your context as extra special. So context is like an attribute that we must understand, but it must never be an excuse to avoid hard work or to avoid making things better. Okay, so there's two sides to that. So when we talk about like a zeal or a religiousness to this, I think you've got to have practicality to it. And so immutable can mean unchanging. Because here's the thing about unchanging, right? There's this. My concern here is not so much about context, but this idea of Gestalt. So you may have heard this German word, Gestalt. It's German for the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So I have a great belief that Scrum is Gestalt. Scrum together is more than just the individual processes and roles and accountabilities and artifacts. In separate, they are less than if you bring them together. And so there's this famous phrase in the world of... I'm not sure who said it. I believe it's a French person said it. So I'm going to claim Voltaire, because everyone blames Voltaire, don't they? If it's a French person, they say Voltaire said it. If it's an English person, they say Winston Churchill said it. If they're American, Abraham Lincoln. But I'm pretty sure Voltaire never said this. So anyway, Voltaire said, humour is like a frog. You dissect it, you kill it. Like you look too closely at a joke or something funny and the humour falls away. And that happens a lot in life. But why is that funny? Well, if you look too close, it isn't funny anymore. But just let the vibes wipe over you and you get it and it's funny, it's hilarious. Don't think too closely about that particular situation. Well, Scrum is like a frog. You dissect it, you kill it. You take it into its constituent parts. It is far less than the bits put together. Right, and I worry a bit about this piecemeal approach people have, this sort of chopping it up into pieces or using certain pieces, and that's what Ken was saying in that original statement. He was saying, only implementing parts of Scrum is possible. The result's not Scrum. So why is he saying that? Well, because there's an issue here. I feel a lot of Scrum is like an MVP. It's like a minimum viable product. Without those pieces, it doesn't quite fly at its full value. Oh, you may get value from certain parts, but who's getting the value from those parts? Management? Leadership? Customers maybe, but what about the developers, the testers, the designers? I think it was Alistair Cockburn. Now, Alistair Cockburn, a fellow expert here on the Agile Network, one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, the person who booked the hotel to hold this summit meeting where they came up with these Agile ideas. I saw years ago on, I think it was Twitter, but I haven't been on Twitter for ages because it's a complete dumpster fire. But I believe it was Twitter, like a tweet storm. He was talking about sort of the mutual beneficial nature of Agile, which was, hey, you want stuff done quicker, business, we will do it quicker. Right? We will be incremental, build it in smaller, sharper lumps to release value to you early. But the trade-off is you've got to give us breathing space and empower us. Give us the power to get the job done. Step back, get out the way, stop bothering us, stop impeding us. So there's a trade-off there. We will be quicker if you leave us alone a bit. And that fundamental idea has always been a part of Agile, like mutual benefit, where you'll be empowered and we'll be able to get stuff out a bit quicker. Now, the problem I'm seeing in organizations today all over the world is they're like, hey, yeah, we want stuff out quicker, but you are not empowered, scumball. And that dark Scrum, that dark, whatever you want to call it, it's not even Agile, there's nothing in our space, but being incremental without being empowered. Sometimes being incremental without even being empirical, which is very dangerous. Build it in small lumps. We have no idea if it's what we want, but we just want it now. So lacking that mutually beneficial, that handshake, as part of our work is really, really dangerous and really, really poisonous. We may be looking at that phrase, that endnote, completely wrong. It's not supposed to be a technical commentary. It's not supposed to be saying what I've just said about Scrum being Gestalt or something. It's actually a bit of a health warning. If you look at Scrum from a product point of view, right, that is about the customers and the misuse of the product. I think you've all heard the urban legend where the old lady microwaved her poodle in her oven to dry it off. and then sued the company because there was no warning label about doing it on the oven. But I'll give you a real life example. Last week on holiday, I was walking towards the beach and there was a small thin road and there was a sign saying, "Do not drive down this road. Do not believe your sat-nav. There is no parking down this road. There is no turning down this road. Do not come down this road." Now, why do you think that sign was there? Do you think someone spontaneously thought, do you know what would be fun today? To completely make up a sign? No. As I like to say, all process is scar tissue. There's a reason that sign exists. There's a reason that process exists, which is people in very large vehicles from very far away drove down that road and got into trouble. Couldn't get out of it, couldn't get reversed. And so that sign's there to warn you away, saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And that is kind of what that immutable phrase is trying to say. It's trying to say, look, if you are going to chop things up and take things out and cut it up and stuff, don't call it Scrum. Because it may work, it could be possible, but there's a health warning on this. Like, have you ever seen allergy warnings? You know, hey, if you've got a bad allergy, like I'm allergic to milk, cow's milk. Oh, like if I need to avoid it a lot of the time. Allergic to peanuts. You've got to avoid those nuts, haven't you? Well, I've got a picture here. Look at this. From Sainsbury's Peanuts in the UK. 100% peanuts. Allergy advice. Contains peanuts. Well, it does. There's a health warning on this. Just to be sure, danger, danger, danger. We've warned you here. If you do something with this, we've warned you. And that's really what it is, like a government health warning to you. Say, look, chop this up at your peril. And please, if you do chop it up and use bits of it, don't call it Scrum. Because that's what's happening in the real world today, all over the world. People have taken Scrum, chopped chunks out of it, thrown bits away that are important. Oh, my production is going to be BA, and we're not going to empower the teams, and I've got no Scrum Masters anymore, and then doing it, and then say, well, that Scrum thing doesn't work very well. Well, if you're going to play it poorly, it doesn't work well. You may have heard of Ron Jeffries' famous article, It's Not Baseball, about people who hate baseball, but then completely blame things that aren't part of baseball for baseball's problems. Oh, we didn't have a full team, there was only 2 of us. We didn't have any bats, and so we had to use sticks instead. Baseball doesn't work. Well, the joke is, we see that a lot with Scrum, where it's like this. Okay, I'm going to play baseball. And I'm going to play this bit of baseball. I've got the ball. But where's the bases? I don't have that. Where's the bats? I don't have that either. But I'm sure this is enough to get the spirit of baseball across. It isn't enough, And so that health warning is there to say, watch out, watch out, watch out. If you cut this around, fiddle with this, you're going to fail. Or there's a high chance of failure. Don't blame us. And for goodness sake, when we say us, we're not saying Nigel or Jeff or Ken. We're saying Scrum. That's the idea. So that's interesting. So the idea of this health warning is saying, not even saying don't do it, it's saying don't do it and don't call it Scrum. Because it isn't. That isn't what we're saying to do. And if you're going off piste, that's your problem, not our problem, really. But actually, that doesn't solve the situation. That doesn't solve the problem, does it really? That's just sort of specifying and saying, don't do that. But what if you are doing that? How do you know not to do that? And this is where we're going to step into, I'm afraid to say, something that the audience, all of it, when I did the talk earlier on, everyone had heard of it before. I've talked about it all the time, but my world famous Nigel scale, if you haven't heard of the Nigel scale, it's a genuine real method. I just called it the Nigel scale as a joke. It's a way to look or analyze Scrum. There's loads of videos all over the internet about it. Quick 30-second version. The Nigel scale's a way to analyze Scrum via 3 angles or 3 aspects. There are aspects, Nigel scale 1, which is there are things that are core, things that are fundamental in our world of work, that if we don't do that, things are going to break and go horribly. Okay? So what we some call hygiene factors. Now, in the world of complexity science, you'll hear a lot of people talk about, well, there's no such thing as core practices. The world is so wide and so varied, everything has a context, and that context reflects what's core and what's not. And that is kind of true. But remember, we're not talking about surviving a zombie apocalypse here with Scrum. We're talking about building products, and pretty much building technology products, and pretty much building software products. And in that space, there are some very, very core practices. I hesitate to call them best, but definitely core, that if we don't do them, we're going to get into trouble, right? And so think about the real world. thou shalt not kill on those stone tablets we mentioned before, 99% of the time, that is true. Okay, there may be a situation where he's a zombie, end of the world, I've got my crossbow. I get it, we've all got a crossbow at that point. But for most of us in real life, in a real life setting in work, don't kill your colleagues. I know, that may be controversial to say, by the way. Ooh, controversial Nigel with his hot topics of don't kill colleagues, don't steal from the office. But come on, you know what I mean. There are some pretty fundamental things there that you wouldn't do. There are more than those. So for me, a great example is if you're a surgeon, you disinfect your hands before surgery. I've used this example 100 times, but it's so true. If a surgeon doesn't disinfect his hands, there's going to be very dire consequences afterwards. So it's not like a choice for the surgeon or an option or a belief system. It's something all surgeons do. However, there isn't that much of those core things in our world of work. There's a few. I believe Scrum is trying to be those core things. That's what I believe. Scrum is trying to be the fundamental core of product development and software product development generally. A lot of what our world is actually Nigel Scale 2 stuff, which is stuff that we call good practice. Practices that work for you, work for me. Hey, they could work for everyone. Could work for everyone, may work for everyone. These are all weasel words we've got to be really careful with. So this is the world where context is king and queen, and you have to be experimental with it. You have to use your prior experience, your expert advice, and run experiments and learn to find out if this is actually the right environment for that technique that's worked other places. And one of the big dangers in our world of work has been people loading a load of good practice into that Scrum box, that core practice box, and then applying it, whitewashing it across all their teams and getting themselves into trouble. A great example of this is things like story points. And oh boy, when I get a chance, I am definitely going to do a exclusive event or a webinar or maybe even one of these episodes on story points and estimating in general. But that's a good practice for some teams, but it's getting such a bad reputation because it's been treated like a core practice for all teams. You see, if you confuse a good practice with a core practice, is a bad practice. Confusing a good practice with a core practice is a bad practice. You know, getting mixed up between what's optional and what's pretty fundamental is a mistake a lot of people make. As I like to say, what people often get wrong is the difference between different and wrong. They confuse variation, hey, we could do this, this or this, and they're all fine, with deviation. Okay, that way we're going to win, that way we're going to lose. Which one shall we pick? Don't pick the losing way. That's deviation, that's just going to varying from the acceptable norm, don't go there. And so people get that wrong all the time in work. And so what we're trying to do with immutability is kind of that core stuff, do it that way, but where you've got the good stuff, that's where you have the flexibility. And the mistake a lot of people make is they've thrown so much into that good practice bucket, treating it like it's Scrum or something like Scrum, you get a load of issues in work. Now, again, the complexity scientists would say there's no such thing as best practice in complex work. That's true. A lot of us aren't in complex work, but even if we are, in our particular domain, there are certain practices I regard as pretty core. What I would say, there's a couple of interesting things here, though, which is that what about the bad practices? So core, good, Nigel Scale 3 is bad practice or anti-pattern. Stuff that sometimes it's just a bad idea, that's okay. But sometimes it looks like a good idea, but when you do it, things go horribly wrong every single time. So examples of this are like normalizing story points across teams. Hey, we're all going to do story points and we're all going to make sure we agree what 1 point means. Sounds so reasonable at scale? Stupid idea, always falls apart, always causes loads of pain, often ends up saying, oh, a day's a point or something like this. I think SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework, says half a day a point, which is just moronic thing to do, because you end up with everyone just estimating in real time or ideal time, completely negating the entire point of points. But it sounded like a good idea at the time. So that's an anti-pattern. Looks like a good idea, you try it, just fails again and again and again, gets you into trouble again and again and again. So we can use this Nigel scale, this 1, 2, 3 point scale, to analyze this immutability question and say, okay, when we talk about immutable and not breaking it, what we're really saying is trying to keep these core factors in place. So we're not like losing our empowerment of our teams or losing our empiricism, whilst giving us flexibility on those contextual applications. And remember, Ken said that earlier on in his end note. He said, Scrum exists only in its entirety and functions well as a container for other techniques, methodologies, and practices. So fiddle those practices as much as you need. But that takes me to the final point of this video, right? Which is, as I've been doing, so this is all about NAME, New Agile Method Experiments. So as I've been experimenting, I've been trying to find out, okay, is Scrum really core? Like, are these bits actually core? Or is there a reason why we shouldn't be doing these things, right? I don't mean Weasley context reasons. I mean just they don't work or they're not as viable as we thought. And what I'm actually starting to discover, from myself, and you may find something similar, is that over the years, Scrum has thinned out. As we've realised, things that were in Scrum back in the 90s were good practice that had application in certain areas, but were not fundamental core practices, and so could be moved off to another layer. Well, the two issues we've got are this. One, there's no really great strong recording of that other area. We seem to have Scrum and Void. And what we really could do within the Agile space is some sort, not a body of knowledge, that's always dangerous, but, libraries, patterns libraries. We could do with an appendix, really, of some of this stuff that's kind of living in that. It was 1, it's now 2. That stuff that lives quite. We're not saying it's good, but we're saying it's really, really good. Like, this is pretty much stuff you're all gonna almost always do. There's no, in the world of complexity, they call it liminal. Like, this liminal space in between the two. It's just kind of like in or out of Scrum. It's in that document, it's out, it's forgotten forever. And I would like to see the community in the world building up some of that stuff a bit better around that space of that sort of that appendix area, right? But what's interesting me more is I actually think there are a couple of things missing maybe from Scrum itself in terms of core. So if you've watched the Tessellization video, you will know I've been having some conversations there about perhaps if we are going to generally have a method that is self-scaling or self-spreading, we need to have some aspect in there to allow our teams to interwork without adding extra frameworks and methods. Something like to allow the teams to plug together to tessellate. Well, one other thing I've been thinking about is been really about. This is now going so inside baseball it hurts. Let's get right inside the ball. There we go, right inside this thing. Because the famous story about Scrum is that Scrum was invented via Jeff Sutherland, one of the co-creators of Scrum, reading a research paper by 2 Japanese professors called Takuchi and Nanaka called the New Product Development Game, which is a research paper they did as research scientists on Japanese companies and their success designing new products. And it's turned out in the last few years that that story is both true and not so true, in that there's like an intermediate layer that's been forgotten. Most of us knew about it implicitly, but it's not been stated explicitly, which was almost certainly Sutherland and Schwaber didn't read that original paper straight away. What they did was read a famous book called Wicked Problems, Righteous Solutions, which contained a whole range of new software development paradigms or ideas, one of which of those ideas was applying these ideas of Takuchi and Nanaka in software development teams, because they were in manufacturing products. Now, that idea was Scrum, like the idea of all working together, the Scrum idea, okay? And that came through, and we've seen that come through, that name Scrum, etc., into Sutherland and Schwaber's work. But there was another one. So they actually had 2 ideas, Takuchi and Nanaka. The other one was what they call sashimi. Basically, breaking the product up into vertical slices, like a sashimi slices of fish, like overlapping slices of value, like overlapping them. And those overlapping phases and those vertical slicing concept is really something that I feel is absolutely critical in our work as well. So it's not just all in one, it's also overlapping work and vertical slicing, like sushi slicing. And actually, if you look at it, Scrum doesn't talk much about that. That's kind of implicit. It's unspoken in Scrum. There's kind of this like ethos that exists in it, this all-in-one overlapping phases approach with vertical slices of value being delivered. But it's not explicitly stated. And I think it probably should be explicitly stated. I actually believe that vertical slicing of work, feature driving your work, should probably be a core feature of what we do, not a good practice where it currently lives. That's my personal beliefs, and perhaps that's some of the work I've been doing on these new agile experiments have been leading me in that direction. I've been thinking over the years, okay, is Scrum going to get thinner? Well, yes it is, but is the future of our world of work so thin, or do we need something a slightly fatter, giving a little more support to the teams around us? Perhaps that's an interesting way for us to experiment and learn more about our future world of work. Final thing about health warnings. Here's another picture from my holiday destination. Warning! Strong currents occur in vicinity of stream and river. Do not bathe or enter the sea in rough surf conditions. It is unsafe to bathe or enter the sea in cold water conditions. Your life could be at risk if you ignore these warnings. That's the thing about health warnings, like Immutable. It can't stop you doing it. There's no Scrum police. They can't come around your house and stop you. They can just warn you. But if you go in that proverbial water in those terrible conditions, sign ain't going to save you. Remember? Before this session, I looked up disclaimers, right? Because that's what the Immutable is. It's a disclaimer. So let's quickly look at what disclaimers are. I've got them over here. I found a website listing out what disclaimers are. A disclaimer is statements that address your liability in specific cases that often aren't addressed in your terms and conditions. Here are some common disclaimers. There are disclaimers on copyright disclaimers. And by the way, one of those is on the Scrum Guide. It's about Creative Commons, about fair use disclaimer, about how you can use it and etc., which I'm using here. No responsibility disclaimer. What's a no responsibility disclaimer? That is basically saying it's a similar to a liability disclaimer. It's a blanket disclaimer saying you're not responsible for what happens when someone misuses your product. That's kind of what that statement says. Say, look, you misuse this, it's your fault. Right? It's not Scrum anymore if you don't do it exactly like this, and it's your fault. You should always read those health warnings. So there we go. That's that one done. I had to do a repeat. I noticed this episode's 7 minutes shorter than the actual roundtable. I'm assuming most of that was questions, though I do have a strong feeling I've missed some part of the subject. Who knows? I'll watch it back and see if anything's missing. I hope this has been useful. I hope that at least it's getting some ideas going in your brains in terms of what we're talking about and why we're talking about it, and perhaps how it can make our world of work a little better. I'm going to be launching the 3rd episode, which is about how deep and how high and how low a method should be, in a couple of weeks' time as a roundtable. I'd love you all to come to the roundtable for a discussion. If you can't make the discussion, I'm going to try and record the roundtable, chop it up into bits, and make it into the 3rd episode of the podcast. Anyway, I can hear the music start playing. Thank you so much. Take care, and I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.